The Galactic Combat Academy on Nexus Prime was supposed to be the pinnacle of military education. Hey, what a joke that turned out to be. Professor Kextal, all 7 feet of scaled saurian arrogance, strutted across the polished metal floor like he owned the galaxy. His reptilian eyes swept over the assembled students with the kind of smug satisfaction that made you want to punch something. Or someone. Today, class, we study advanced combat theory, he hissed, forked tongue flicking out dramatically. Because of course it did. The art of defeating your enemies through superior positioning, strength, and tactical awareness. The classroom was packed with the galaxy's finest specimens of lethal evolution. Gorath, the massive insectoid from Hive Prime, clicked his mandibles appreciatively while flexing arms that could crush titanium. His exoskeleton gleamed under the artificial lighting, each segment designed by millions of years of warfare. Thane, the living rock formation from the mineral worlds, shifted his boulder-like frame with sounds like grinding stone. Even sitting down, he towered over everyone else. Zara, the 4-armed warrior from the Keth Dominion, practiced quick-draw motions with all her appendages simultaneously, each movement precise and deadly. Then there was Maya Brooks. The human girl sat in the very back corner, chin propped on one small hand, looking about as interested as someone watching paint dry in a vacuum. She couldn't have been more than 5.5 feet tall, maybe 130 pounds soaking wet. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the standard academy uniform that seemed 3 sizes too big for her tiny frame. She looked frankly ridiculous. As I was saying, Kextal continued, his voice dripping with condescension as his gaze lingered on Maya, true combat requires physical superiority. The weak? His eyes narrowed, simply cannot compete with the strong. This is why certain species should perhaps reconsider their presence in advanced combat courses. A few students chuckled. Gorath's clicking grew louder, which passed for laughter among his kind. Thane's rocky surface actually cracked in what might have been amusement. Maya just yawned. Not a fake yawn, mind you. A genuine, jaw-cracking, utterly bored yawn that said she'd rather be literally anywhere else in the known universe. She followed it up by stretching slightly, and then returning to her previous position of supreme disinterest. Kextal's scales bristled with irritation. Now then, Kextal announced, puffing out his chest like a peacock with delusions of grandeur, let us examine the fundamental principles of galactic combat doctrine. He activated the holographic display with a flourish that was entirely unnecessary but perfectly in character. 3-dimensional figures appeared, demonstrating various combat stances that looked impressive if you ignored the fact that they were basically just fancy ways to stand around looking menacing. To observe the Keth power stance, he gestured toward a 4-armed figure. Notice how all limbs are positioned for maximum striking potential. But the Saurian dominance position, another figure materialized, utilizing our superior reach and natural weaponry. And of course the Hive swarm formation, where our insectoid friends use their exoskeletal advantages. Gorath clicked approvingly, because apparently even giant bugs enjoyed being teacher's pet. These techniques, Kextal continued with the air of someone revealing the secrets of the universe, have been perfected over millennia by species that actually understand warfare. Unlike certain primitive worlds that still engage in what they laughably call martial arts. The class erupted in the kind of laughter that bullies perfect in secondary school. Zara's 4 arms slapped her knees simultaneously, which was frankly just showing off. Thane's rocky chuckle sounded like an avalanche having a giggle fit. Oh yes, Kextal's forked tongue flicked out in obvious delight, the humans and their quaint little fighting styles. Boxing, wrestling, something called kung fu that sounds like a digestive disorder, more laughter. Because nothing says advanced civilization like making fun of cultures you clearly know nothing about. They actually believe, and here Kextal paused for dramatic effect, because he was just that kind of professor, that technique can overcome raw physical superiority. Imagine. As if their fragile little bodies could possibly compete with true evolutionary perfection. Meanwhile, in the back corner, Maya had pulled out what appeared to be a standard academy datapad. Instead of taking notes on the professor's brilliant insights into combat theory, she was quite obviously doodling. Her stylus moved in lazy circles and swoops, creating what looked like a cartoon version of Kextao with an absurdly large head and tiny arms. The human form is simply inadequate for serious combat, Kextao proclaimed, warming to his favorite subject. Weak bones, soft skin, limited reach, pathetic muscle density. Really, it's almost cruel to allow them in advanced courses. Maya added what appeared to be a speech bubble to her cartoon, though from this distance nobody could make out the words. Probably something flattering about their esteemed instructor's teaching methods. Kextao's eye twitched as he noticed her complete lack of attention. Here he was, dispensing wisdom that lesser species could only dream of understanding, and this tiny human was treating his lecture like background noise. Perhaps, he hissed, his voice taking on a decidedly sharper edge, our human student would care to share her thoughts on combat theory, since she seems so engaged with the material. Maya looked up from her doodle with the expression of someone who had just been asked to explain quantum physics to a particularly slow houseplant. "Oh, I'm sorry, Professor," Maya said in a tone so flat it could have been used as a ruler. "Were you talking to me?" The audible gasp from the class was almost comical. Apparently, speaking to Professor Kextao without the proper reverence was tantamount to galactic treason. Who knew? Kextao's scales shifted from their usual green to a lovely shade of irritated purple. "Indeed I was, Miss Brooks. Since you seem so disinterested in learning proper combat techniques, perhaps you would benefit from a practical demonstration." A demonstration, Maya repeated, as if she were confirming the weather forecast. Yes. Kextao's eyes lit up with the kind of predatory gleam that screamed bad idea incoming. "Come down here, child. Let me show the class the difference between primitive human fighting and true combat mastery." The other students practically vibrated with excitement. Gorath's mandibles clicked rapidly, which was apparently insectoid for this is going to be hilarious. Zara leaned forward in her seat, all four arms crossed in anticipation. Even Thane's rocky exterior seemed to shimmer with amusement. Maya sighed. Actually sighed. Like being asked to participate in a combat demonstration was roughly equivalent to being asked to take out the trash. "Do I have to?" she asked, still not moving from her seat. "I'm afraid I must insist," Kextao replied, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "For your own educational benefit, of course." "Of course," Maya echoed, then slowly, reluctantly, stood up. She moved with all the enthusiasm of someone heading to a dentist appointment. Her tiny frame looked even more ridiculous next to the towering alien specimens around her. A few students actually started snickering again, because apparently they hadn't learned their lesson about premature celebration. Maya shuffled down to the front of the class, her hands shoved deep in her pockets, shoulders slouched in a way that screamed I'd rather be literally anywhere else. "Now then," Kextao announced to the class, clearly enjoying himself, "observe how a properly trained warrior handles an inferior opponent." "Inferior," Maya repeated in that same deadpan tone. "Right. Right. Don't worry, little one," Kextao said, his voice taking on the patronizing quality adults use when talking to particularly dim children. "I'll be very gentle. We wouldn't want you to get hurt during your first real lesson in combat." "My first lesson," Maya said. "Not a question. Just a statement delivered with all the emotion of reading a grocery list." "Indeed. Now, the first thing you need to understand about defensive positioning," Kextao began circling her like a predator toying with its prey, "is that you must never allow your opponent to control the engagement. You see, your human instincts will tell you to back away, to flee, but that only shows weakness." "Weakness," Maya nodded solemnly. "Got it. Exactly. Now, when I reach for your arm like this," Kextao extended one clawed hand toward her wrist, "your natural response will be to pull away. But that's wrong. You must stand firm, maintain your position, never show fear." "Never show fear," Maya repeated, watching his approaching hand with about as much concern as she might show a butterfly landing nearby. "That's right. Now hold still while I demonstrate proper grip control." And that, as they say, was when things got interesting. Because Maya Brooks, it turned out, had some very definite opinions about people grabbing her without permission, and she was about to share those opinions in a way that would require medical attention. What happened next would be analyzed, debated, and probably taught in combat academies across the galaxy for generations to come. Though most of those future instructors would probably get the details wrong, because what actually occurred was so fast, so effortless, and so utterly casual that it defied everything these advanced civilizations thought they knew about physics. Kextal's clawed hand reached for Maya's wrist with all the confidence of someone who had never encountered actual resistance in his entire pampered academic life. His movement was textbook perfect according to Saurian combat doctrine, properly telegraphed, appropriately intimidating, designed to demonstrate superior reach and strength. Maya, meanwhile, had apparently decided that standing was overrated. She simply sat back down. Not dramatically. Not with any flourish or combat-ready positioning. She just sat. Right there on the floor, cross-legged, like she was settling in for a picnic. Her expression remained exactly the same, that perfect mask of polite boredom that suggested she was mentally composing her grocery list. Kextal blinked, momentarily confused. This wasn't in any of his combat manuals. Miss Brooks, you need to stand up for this demonstration to work properly. Do I, though? Maya asked, tilting her head slightly. Yes, you absolutely do. How can I show proper defensive positioning if you're sitting on the floor like a child? Okay, Maya shrugged. But I'm comfortable here. The professor's purple scales were now shifting toward a rather alarming shade of crimson. Stand up. Now. Or what? Maya asked with genuine curiosity. That did it. Kextal's patience, what little he'd possessed to begin with, evaporated entirely. Fine. If you insist on being difficult, I'll simply have to adjust my demonstration accordingly. He reached down toward her with both hands now, intending to grab her arms and haul her to her feet like the misbehaving child he clearly thought she was. His movement was sharp, aggressive, designed to intimidate and overwhelm through superior size and strength. And that was his first mistake. Maya's response was so subtle that half the class missed it entirely. Her right hand moved maybe 6 inches. Just a tiny shift, barely visible, intercepting Kextal's reaching arm at the wrist. Her fingers wrapped around his scaled appendage with what looked like the gentlest possible grip, like she was holding a delicate flower. Then she did something that would haunt Kextal's nightmares for the rest of his considerably shortened teaching career. She twisted. Not dramatically. Not with any visible effort or strain. Just a small, precise rotation of her wrist that used Kextal's own forward momentum against him. The professor's hand, which had been reaching confidently toward her, suddenly found itself traveling in a direction that his elbow very much did not want to go. Physics, as it turned out, had some opinions about that. The sound was distinctive. A sharp crack that echoed through the classroom like a gunshot, followed immediately by what could only be described as the most undignified shriek ever produced by a member of the supposedly superior saurian species. Kextal's arm now bent at an angle that arms were definitely not designed to bend at. His face cycled through several interesting colors before settling on a pale green that suggested he was either about to faint or throw up, possibly both. Maya, meanwhile, remained exactly where she was, cross-legged on the floor, still holding the professor's wrist in that same gentle grip, looking about as concerned as someone who had just swatted a particularly annoying fly. "Ha," she said conversationally, examining the professor's newly redesigned arm with mild interest. "That's not supposed to bend that way, is it?" The classroom had gone so quiet you could have heard a pin drop in the vacuum of space. Gorath's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely, frozen halfway through what had been an anticipatory chatter. Zara's 4 arms hung limply at her sides, as if her brain had simply forgotten how to operate them. Thane's rocky exterior had gone completely still, not even the usual subtle shifting of geological processes. Even the air recycling system seemed to have paused out of shock. Kextal made a sound somewhere between a whimper and a hiss, still staring in disbelief at his arm. which was now pointing in a direction that definitely wasn't standard Saurian anatomy. Maya finally released his wrist, letting his arm drop with a wet thud that made several students visibly flinch. "Professor?" she asked politely, as if inquiring about homework assignments. "Are you going to continue the demonstration, or should I go back to my seat now?" The professor's response was not what you'd call academically appropriate. Kextal's shriek could probably be heard 3 decks away. He clutched his mangled arm to his chest, scales shifting through a rainbow of colors that would have been beautiful if they weren't indicating severe trauma and possible shock. His forked tongue flicked in and out rapidly, tasting the air as if it might contain some explanation for what had just happened to his superior Saurian anatomy. "What did you do to me?" he screamed, his voice cracking like a teenager hitting puberty. "What did you do?" The other students were having their own collective crisis. Gorath had actually taken several steps backward, his massive insectoid frame bumping into desks as he tried to put distance between himself and the tiny human who had just casually dismantled their instructor. His compound eyes were fixed on Maya with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. Zara was pressed against the far wall, all 4 arms spread wide as if she could somehow make herself smaller. Her warrior pride had apparently evaporated the moment Maya's gentle grip had redefined basic anatomy. Thane's rocky exterior was actually trembling, small pebbles falling from his frame like nervous sweat. Maya, oblivious to the panic she'd caused, finally decided that sitting was indeed overrated. She stood up slowly, stretching her arms above her head with a satisfied little grunt that suggested she'd been sitting too long. The movement was so casual, so perfectly normal, that it somehow made everything that had just happened even more terrifying. "Oh, that," she said, as if Kextal had asked about the weather instead of screaming about his reconstructed arm. "That's just basic joint manipulation. Pretty standard stuff, really." "Standard?" Kextal's voice went up another octave, which was impressive considering he was already approaching frequencies that only small mammals could hear. "Well, yeah," Maya shrugged, rolling her shoulders to work out a crick. "I mean, you grabbed me without permission. Where I come from, that's generally considered rude. So I applied a little leverage to your wrist, used your forward momentum against you, and redirected the force through your elbow joint until it exceeded its structural limitations." She delivered this explanation with the same tone someone might use to describe making a sandwich. The class stared at her in the kind of silence that follows truly catastrophic events. Somewhere in the distance, an alarm began to sound, probably triggered by Kextal's continued screaming. "See, here's the thing about humans," Maya continued, apparently deciding this was an excellent teaching moment. "We're what you might call persistence predators. We're not the biggest or the strongest or the fastest. But we're really, really good at figuring out how to take down things that are bigger, stronger, and faster than us." She gestured casually toward the still whimpering professor. "Your species probably evolved fighting other saurians, right? Similar size, similar strength, similar reach. So your combat techniques are all about using your natural advantages." Kextal managed to nod through his pain, though whether this was agreement or just his head shaking from shock was unclear. "Humans had to deal with everything," Maya continued cheerfully. "Cave bears, saber-toothed cats, each other, you name it. So we developed techniques specifically designed to let smaller, weaker fighters defeat larger, stronger opponents. Leverage, pressure points, joint manipulation, using an attacker's strength and momentum against them." She paused, looking around at the terrified faces surrounding her. "We've been doing this for thousands of years, Professor. It's not primitive, it's specialized." Gorath made a sound like grinding metal, which was probably insectoid for "oh no, we've made a terrible mistake." "The thing is," Maya added, her tone still maddeningly conversational, "most of our martial arts assume you're fighting someone bigger and stronger than you are. Because historically, that was usually the case. So when someone actually is bigger and stronger," she gestured again toward Kextal's creative new arm configuration, "well, the techniques work even better. She looked around the classroom with mild interest, as if noticing the atmosphere of terror for the first time. Is someone going to call medical? Because I think the professor might need some help with that. As if summoned by her words, the classroom doors burst open with the kind of dramatic flair that emergency responders across the galaxy seem to specialize in. The medical team rushed in, scanner devices beeping frantically as they assessed the situation. Their leader, a competent-looking Altarian with 6 arms and an expression of professional concern, took one look at Kex Tal's creative arm arrangement and immediately began barking orders in 3 different languages. Right behind them came station security, led by Commander Veltar, whose blue-skinned Rigelian features were creased with confusion. He surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had seen every kind of trouble the galaxy could produce, but this particular tableau seemed to be giving him pause. What exactly happened here? He demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to getting straight answers. Before anyone else could speak, Maya raised her hand politely. I broke Professor Kex Tal's arm, sir. The commander's expression suggested he was reconsidering his career choices. You broke his arm? Yes, sir. He grabbed me without permission, so I applied a basic wrist control technique that resulted in structural failure of his elbow joint. Maya delivered this report with the same professional tone that security officers used in their incident reports. She destroyed him. Gorath suddenly exploded, his clicking mandibles creating a sound like a broken percussion section. She was sitting down. She barely moved. How is this possible? Maya turned to the massive insectoid with genuine curiosity. You want to know how it's possible? Yes. Several voices chorused at once, including some of the medical team who had paused in their treatment to listen. Well, Maya began, settling into lecture mode like she was discussing her favorite hobby. It's really not that complicated. Humans have been doing this stuff for millennia. We call it martial arts, and it's based on some pretty simple principles. She held up one finger. First, you use your opponent's force against them. Professor Kex Tal was moving toward me with considerable momentum. I just redirected that energy in a direction his joint couldn't handle. A second finger joined the first. Second, you target structural weak points. Every species has them. Joints, pressure points, places where the anatomy simply can't handle force from certain angles. Third, she added a third finger, you stay calm and use precise technique instead of brute strength. Panic makes you sloppy. Anger makes you stupid. So you just don't. Commander Veltar was taking notes on his datapad, though he looked like he wasn't entirely sure why. But Thane rumbled, his rocky voice filled with something approaching awe. You're so small. So fragile. Maya actually laughed at that, a genuine sound of amusement that somehow made her seem even more terrifying. Fragile? Humans survived ice ages, plagues, wars with weapons that could crack planets and each other for thousands of years. We're from a death world where everything tries to kill us from the moment we're born. She gestured casually toward the still groaning professor. This is just Tuesday for us. The silence that followed this statement was the kind usually reserved for religious revelations or natural disasters. Gorath's voice, when he finally found it, was barely a whisper. All humans can do this. Maya's smile was perhaps the most terrifying thing anyone in that room had ever seen. Not because it was cruel or threatening, but because it was so perfectly, genuinely friendly. Oh no, she said cheerfully. I'm actually pretty average. You should see what our actual fighters can do. The medical team chose that moment to finally get Kex Tal onto a stretcher, his continued whimpering providing a soundtrack to everyone's rapidly changing worldview. The next morning, Maya returned to her usual seat in the back corner of Advanced Combat Theory. Same bored expression, same oversized uniform, same general air of someone who would rather be counting ceiling tiles than listening to lectures about galactic warfare. The difference was in everyone else. Where yesterday the classroom had been packed, today there was a distinct radius of empty seats around Maya. Not because anyone had asked them to move. They just had. Gorath had somehow managed to squeeze his massive frame into a seat on the opposite side of the room. Zara sat in the front row, all four arms folded protectively across her chest. Even Thane had relocated, his rocky bulk positioned as far from the tiny human as physics would allow. The substitute instructor, a nervous-looking Centaurian named Professor Helix, approached the day's lesson with the careful reverence usually reserved for handling unstable explosives. Before we begin today's demonstration, he announced, his voice cracking slightly, I'd like to ask if anyone objects to participating. Miss Brooks? Any thoughts on today's lesson plan? Maya looked up from her doodle, which today appeared to be a remarkably accurate sketch of yesterday's medical emergency. Nope, she said simply. Carry on. Professor Helix visibly relaxed, though he still maintained what could generously be called a respectful distance. Maya settled back into her seat, watching as the so-called advanced civilizations tiptoed around her like she was a live grenade. It was almost funny, really. These species had conquered star systems, built galactic empires, developed technology that could reshape reality itself. But they'd never learned the most important lesson in the universe. Always check your assumptions about the quiet ones in the back row. Because sometimes the most dangerous predator in the room is the one that looks like prey.